The HOA president, Blythe Carrington, was a woman of authority, known for her strict enforcement of the rules. Her job was to maintain order, but she often crossed the line between enforcing fairness and controlling every detail of her residents' lives. Vaughn Royston, a quiet man who had lived in the neighborhood for years, had seen Blythe's actions become more and more intrusive. Vaughn was a man of simplicity. He enjoyed his garden, a modest collection of flowers and shrubs that added color to his front yard. It wasn't extravagant or showy, just a peaceful personal hobby. But one day Blythe noticed the flowers and decided that they were against HOA rules. According to the HOA's guidelines, all front yard landscaping must be uniform and neat, with no exceptions for individual expression. The fine was absurd. The HOA claimed that the flowers were unapproved landscaping and that they violated the community's aesthetic guidelines. Vaughn, however, couldn't fathom how something as innocent as flowers could be seen as an offense. It was a small issue, but for Vaughn, it represented something larger: the erosion of individuality and personal freedom under the guise of community standards. Vaughn made a conscious decision not to submit to the HOA's demands. While other residents may have complied by removing their plants or paying the fines imposed by the HOA, Vaughn saw this situation as an opportunity to assert his rights. The issue at hand was no longer just about the flowers in his yard. It was about the fundamental right to express oneself and the ability to maintain a space that reflected personal values and preferences. Rather than simply removing the flowers, Vaughn chose to confront the situation directly by taking an active stand. His goal was to make a statement, one that could not be dismissed or overlooked. He began working on his front yard, but unlike previous attempts this time, his efforts were deliberate and designed to be a powerful symbol. Instead of merely adding more flowers, Vaughn expanded his vision. He decided to transform his yard into a significant, deliberate work of self-expression. Over the course of several weeks, Vaughn dedicated his efforts to reshaping his front yard. He carefully selected and arranged wildflowers, sculpted bushes into intricate shapes, and incorporated ornamental statues to enhance the design. The result was a visually striking display, with each element chosen to convey his individuality. Vaughn's yard had evolved from a simple garden into a distinctive expression of his identity. To him, this was no longer about following a set of rules. It was about creating a personal space that represented his values. Vaughn's creation became increasingly noticeable within the neighborhood. While some neighbors were initially uncertain about the design, they quickly recognized that this was not just a decorative choice, it was a deliberate challenge to the HOA's control. Some found the display to be bold and impressive, viewing it as an act of personal expression that pushed the boundaries of conformity. Others, however, saw it as an infringement on the uniformity they had come to expect in the neighborhood. The growing divide between residents became apparent as opinions about the yard's transformation spread rapidly. The news of Vaughn's actions reached Blythe, the president of the HOA. She quickly interpreted his yard as a direct challenge to her authority and the rules she had implemented. Vaughn's decision to ignore the regulations was seen as an open defiance of the community standards she had worked so hard to enforce. Blythe was determined to address this perceived rebellion and restore the order she believed the HOA represented. She felt that the spectacle Vaughn had created in his yard could not be allowed to persist without consequences. Her first response was to issue another fine. This time, however, the fine carried more weight. It was no longer about minor infractions like the flowers, but rather the entire transformation of Vaughn's yard into a public statement. The spectacle had gained visibility and attention, turning his property into a focal point within the community. Blythe believed that if left unchecked, Vaughn's actions would serve as an example for others to disregard the HOA's rules. She saw this as a necessary action to maintain control and prevent further challenges to her leadership. Vaughn's response was unwavering. He remained resolute in his belief that his yard was an expression of personal freedom and creativity. The act of placing a fine on him for his yard's transformation was, in his view, an attempt to stifle his right to make personal choices in his own home. His resolve was strengthened by the growing support from some neighbors who admired his boldness and recognized the deeper message behind his actions. At the same time, others continued to voice their concerns, creating a divided atmosphere that reinforced the widening rift between residents and the HOA's leadership. Despite the escalating tensions, Vaughn remained focused on his objective. He viewed the fine as a minor obstacle in a larger fight for personal autonomy and the right to express individuality. His yard had become a symbol of resistance, a visual representation of his rejection of the HOA's overreach. By making the yard a public spectacle, Vaughn was forcing the HOA and the neighborhood to confront the issue head-on. Blythe, however, was not willing to back down either. The HOA, under her leadership, had always maintained a strict stance on enforcing rules, and she was determined to protect the integrity of the community's guidelines. She could not afford to let one resident challenge her authority without repercussions. As she prepared to confront Vaughn again, she knew that her next steps would need to be decisive in order to prevent her control from being questioned further. The HOA's image and her position as its president depended on it. Thus, the conflict between Vaughn and Blythe reached a critical point, with each side digging in their heels. For Vaughn, this was no longer about the flowers or the yard. It was about his right to assert his identity in the face of an institution that sought to limit his freedom. For Blythe, it was about maintaining the rules that had defined the community for years and preserving her role as the enforcer of those rules. The outcome of this dispute would determine the future dynamics within Crestview Estates. The confrontation between Vaughn and Blythe reached a decisive point when Blythe made her approach to enforce the HOA's rules once more. The focus had shifted beyond the original issue of flowers to a broader struggle regarding control over personal property and individual rights. Blythe, representing the HOA, was compelled to act in a way that demonstrated authority and reinforced the rules she believed governed the community. The tension surrounding the yard's transformation had become an issue that extended well beyond aesthetic concerns. In response to Vaughn's display of defiance, Blythe sought to reassert control by confronting him directly. Her goal was clear. She wanted to have the modifications removed, returning the property to compliance with the community's standards. Blythe's actions were driven by a need to uphold the authority of the HOA's regulations, which, in her view, ensured uniformity and order within the neighborhood. She considered any deviation from those standards a threat to the cohesiveness of the community and to her own position of leadership. Vaughn, however, remained resolute in his refusal to comply with Blythe's demands. He understood that his actions had gone beyond merely beautifying his yard. They represented his refusal to conform to an increasingly oppressive set of regulations. Vaughn's decision was grounded in the belief that personal property should be free from excessive restrictions and that individuals had the right to use their land as they saw fit, provided their actions did not harm others. This principle, he felt, was being undermined by the HOA's rigid enforcement of rules that he believed were overly controlling. Rather than engaging in a back-and-forth argument, Vaughn's stance was straightforward. He stated clearly that his yard would remain as it was, asserting that it was his property and his choice to maintain it according to his own values. His decision to stand firm, despite the potential consequences, underscored his determination to challenge the existing power dynamics that had long been established in the neighborhood. By refusing to yield to Blythe's authority, Vaughn was making a broader statement about personal autonomy and the right to self-expression in a society that often emphasized conformity. Blythe, faced with Vaughn's unwavering response, was left with few options. She knew that her ability to enforce the HOA's rules depended on her capacity to maintain control over residents like Vaughn. However, the more she pressed for compliance, the more it became clear that her approach was not yielding the desired results. As a result, she sought to escalate the situation by threatening further fines and the involvement of the HOA board. This was intended to demonstrate the seriousness of her position and to make clear that she was willing to take extreme measures to maintain the standards she believed were essential for the neighborhood's integrity. Despite Blythe's increasingly forceful tactics, Vaughn remained unshaken. He did not respond to her threats with fear or retreat, but instead reiterated his position. He would not dismantle his yard. His refusal to comply with her demands represented his broader challenge to the authority that the HOA had exercised over the residents. Vaughn's calm demeanor and straightforward refusal stood in contrast to Blythe's escalating frustration. He saw the conflict not just as a disagreement over yard aesthetics, but as a confrontation over control and the boundaries of authority within the community. The situation came to an abrupt turning point when Blythe, in her haste to leave the confrontation, failed to notice a part of Vaughn's newly sculpted landscaping. As she reversed her SUV, her vehicle collided with the edge of the yard, causing significant damage to the bumper. This incident was emblematic of the larger conflict. Blythe's strict adherence to the rules and her efforts to impose them without consideration for individual circumstances had, in this instance, resulted in an unintended consequence. The collision served as a physical manifestation of the clash between her control over the HOA and Vaughn's resistance to that control. The incident with the vehicle was more than a mere accident. It symbolized the failure of Blythe's approach to maintaining order through strict enforcement. Her control over the HOA's rules had led her to overlook the very personal nature of the property in question. The irony of the situation was not lost on anyone who witnessed it. Blythe, who had spent so much time asserting her authority and enforcing conformity, found herself trapped by her own actions. The damage to her SUV, a result of her attempt to impose her will on Vaughn, was a stark reminder of the limits of power when it fails to take individual rights into account. For Vaughn, the confrontation reinforced the value of standing firm in the face of authority. While Blythe's efforts to enforce the rules had escalated the conflict, his response remained consistent. He was not willing to compromise on his right to use his property as he saw fit. The events that transpired highlighted the growing disconnect between the HOA's rigid rules and the individual autonomy of residents like Vaughn. In the aftermath of the confrontation, the broader implications of the clash were apparent. The community had witnessed firsthand the struggle between personal freedom and institutional control. Vaughn's resistance, in the form of his unyielding stance on his property and his refusal to be intimidated, stood in contrast to Blythe's reliance on rules and regulations as tools of control. The damage to Blythe's vehicle marked the moment when her power was visibly undermined by the very actions she had taken to assert it. Ultimately, the confrontation was a turning point in the ongoing conflict. The incident signaled a shift in the dynamics of authority within the community. It demonstrated the limits of top-down control when individuals like Vaughn were willing to challenge the established order. Blythe's inability to maintain her authority in the face of Vaughn's refusal to comply forced her to reconsider the effectiveness of her leadership. This moment of reckoning was not just a setback for Blythe, but a critical juncture in the broader struggle for control within the neighborhood. In the aftermath of the confrontation, the situation began to evolve rapidly. The event had shifted from a localized dispute between two individuals into a broader discussion regarding the power dynamics within Crestview Estates. Blythe, in her attempt to maintain control, had inadvertently exposed cracks in the system she had worked so hard to uphold. Vaughn's refusal to comply with the HOA's regulations, compounded by the incident with Blythe's vehicle, had created a moment of reckoning within the community. While Blythe hoped that her call to the police would result in an immediate resolution, the reality was more complicated. The officers who arrived were faced with a situation that did not fit neatly into any established category of conflict. It was not a straightforward case of property damage or personal offense. The police quickly realized that the issue at hand was not merely about a violation of rules, but about the larger systemic question of authority and fairness within the community. The growing support for Vaughn among his neighbors became increasingly apparent. Many residents, previously passive, began to voice their opinions openly. The issue was no longer about the yard itself. It had become a matter of individual rights and the limits of institutional control. As Vaughn's actions gained attention, several neighbors expressed their admiration for his decision to stand firm against the HOA's strict enforcement. This shift in public opinion marked a significant turning point in the community's relationship with the HOA. For some, the incident served as a catalyst for questioning the role of the HOA in regulating personal property. The HOA had long been seen as the enforcer of order, with rules that were meant to ensure uniformity and harmony within the neighborhood. However, for a growing number of residents, these same rules had started to feel more like tools of control, limiting personal expression and autonomy. The idea that a resident could be penalized for simple landscaping choices or for challenging the status quo struck many as an overreach of power. As the conversation spread throughout the neighborhood, it became clear that the community was divided. Some remained loyal to Blythe and the HOA's role in maintaining order, believing that the rules were necessary for the upkeep of the neighborhood's aesthetic. For these residents, the issue with Vaughn's yard was a matter of maintaining consistency and ensuring that one person's actions did not undermine the collective harmony. They viewed the HOA's actions as necessary to prevent a breakdown in the community's standards. On the other side, there was a growing movement in favor of Vaughn's right to express his individuality through his property. For these residents, the issue was about fairness and the right to personal autonomy. They questioned the fairness of the HOA's selective enforcement, particularly in light of how the rules were being applied inconsistently across the neighborhood. Some began to openly criticize Blythe for her authoritarian approach and for using the HOA's power to exert control over residents in ways that seemed unjust. The involvement of the police highlighted the complexity of the situation. Initially, Blythe had hoped that law enforcement would intervene decisively, reinforcing her authority and punishing Vaughn for what she considered an infraction. However, the officers found themselves caught between two competing perspectives and ultimately chose not to take action against Vaughn. The decision not to arrest or fine him was a subtle but significant shift. It acknowledged that the dispute was not merely about the violation of a rule but about a deeper, systemic issue within the HOA's governance and its relationship with the residents. The police's departure left the matter unresolved, but it allowed the community to take the conversation into its own hands. With no immediate legal resolution, the residents began to debate the merits of the HOA's policies and leadership. Some residents took the opportunity to discuss the broader implications of the HOA's power, questioning whether the rules that had long governed the neighborhood were truly serving the best interests of everyone. Vaughn, for his part, had not anticipated that his defiance would spark such widespread discussion. His actions, which had initially been a quiet protest, had become the focal point of a larger conversation about the balance between personal rights and collective control. He had not sought to lead a movement or to challenge the HOA on a broad scale. His aim had been simply to defend his personal choices regarding his own property. However, his quiet resistance had inadvertently led to a larger transformation in the community's understanding of fairness, control, and personal freedom. The conversation within the neighborhood continued to evolve, with some residents beginning to demand changes in the way the HOA operated. There was a noticeable shift toward questioning the necessity of certain rules and the extent of the HOA's power. What had once been a system based on maintaining order and uniformity now appeared in the eyes of many to be an oppressive force that stifled personal expression. In the weeks following the confrontation, a movement began to take shape within the neighborhood. Residents started to organize discussions and meetings to address the concerns raised by Vaughn's actions. These conversations were not limited to the specific issue of the flowers in Vaughn's yard, but expanded to the larger question of how the HOA's policies should be structured moving forward. As the community discussed these issues openly, it became evident that a shift was taking place. The strict rules that had once been unquestioned were now under scrutiny, and the residents were beginning to demand a more balanced approach to governance. The aftermath of the confrontation was not marked by an immediate resolution, but rather by the beginning of a longer process of change. Vaughn's refusal to conform had led to a deeper questioning of authority within Crestview Estates. While Blythe and the HOA had initially seemed all-powerful, their hold on the community was now being challenged. This shift in perspective would not only affect the HOA's future policies, but also the broader dynamics within the neighborhood. The conversation had started, and there was no going back. In the weeks following the confrontation, a significant shift occurred within Crestview Estates. Blythe's authority, once unquestioned, began to erode as community members spoke out against her leadership. The rigid enforcement of rules that had long defined the HOA started to come under scrutiny. Residents who had previously been passive now openly questioned the fairness of the regulations and their impact on individual freedoms. The collective voice of the neighborhood, once subdued, became a force that could no longer be ignored. As this new wave of dialogue unfolded, pressure mounted on Blythe to address the concerns of the community. She had always prided herself on maintaining order and upholding the rules, but the challenges she faced from residents who felt disenfranchised forced her into a difficult position. The increasing calls for change and the growing dissatisfaction with her leadership made it clear that her time as HOA president was coming to an end. Blythe ultimately resigned from her position, marking a pivotal moment for Crestview Estates. While the resignation may have been a personal blow to Blythe, it was a victory for the residents who had grown frustrated with the rigid control and arbitrary enforcement that had characterized the HOA under her leadership. With her departure, the community found itself at a crossroads, one where they could reshape the rules and redefine the values that governed the neighborhood. Vaughn, once a quiet and private resident, emerged as a key figure in the evolving landscape of Crestview Estates. His resistance, which had initially been driven by a desire to preserve his right to maintain his property as he saw fit, had sparked a broader conversation about fairness, individuality, and the limits of authority. As the community re-evaluated its policies, Vaughn's actions were recognized not just as a defiance of authority, but as a catalyst for much-needed change. With the leadership of the HOA now in flux, a new group of residents stepped forward to take charge. These individuals understood the need for rules, but they also recognized that the previous approach had been too rigid, stifling personal expression and creating a culture of fear. The new leadership, which included Vaughn, began working together to rewrite the community guidelines, ensuring that they were fair, transparent, and more reflective of the diverse needs and values of the residents. The revised rules emphasized respect for individual expression, allowing residents to personalize their properties with elements such as flowers, sculptures, and other personal touches. However, these modifications were to be made within certain parameters to ensure that they did not pose safety risks or cause significant disruptions to the community. The updated guidelines struck a balance between maintaining the aesthetic of the neighborhood and allowing for personal expression, fostering a more inclusive and flexible environment for all. Vaughn's yard, once the center of controversy, became a symbol of this transformation. What had begun as an act of resistance had turned into a permanent fixture, representing the community's newfound commitment to personal freedom and individuality. The yard, with its flowers and sculptures, now stood as a testament to the power of standing up for one's beliefs and the capacity for change within a tightly controlled system. It served as a reminder that even small acts of defiance could result in significant, lasting change. As the community moved forward, the HOA evolved into a more open and transparent organization. The new leadership was committed to working for the benefit of all residents, ensuring that the rules served to foster a sense of community without infringing on personal autonomy. This shift marked the end of an era where the HOA was seen as a tool of control and suppression, and the beginning of a new chapter focused on fairness, inclusion, and mutual respect. Vaughn's quiet stand had sparked a movement that reshaped the very fabric of Crestview Estates. The lesson from his actions was clear. Even when faced with powerful systems or authorities, it is possible to challenge the status quo and bring about meaningful change. Vaughn's refusal to comply with unfair rules had not only altered the trajectory of the neighborhood, but had also demonstrated that individual actions could have a profound impact on the collective future. In the end, the story of Vaughn and the HOA in Crestview Estates became a powerful example of how communities can transform when residents come together to challenge unjust authority. The victory was not just for Vaughn, but for everyone in the neighborhood, who had long been subjected to rules that stifled creativity and individuality. Through his actions, Vaughn showed that standing up for one's principles could lead to a greater good, creating a community where everyone's voice could be heard and personal freedoms could be respected. The neighborhood, once defined by rigid conformity, now embraced diversity and self-expression, marking a significant turning point in the community's history.